The fluorescent light flickered above Deborah's desk like a dying heartbeat. 15 years. 15 years of arriving early, staying late, and swallowing insults that tasted like poison. But tonight, as she stared at the email that had just landed in her inbox, she felt something inside her finally snap. Performance review, final warning, the subject line read. Below it, her supervisor had written words that would haunt her for months. Your recent work has been substandard. This is your last chance to prove your worth to this company. Frankly, at your age, you should be grateful we're giving you another opportunity. At your age? The words echoed in the empty office building. At 55, Deborah had become invisible, a ghost haunting the corridors of a company that had sucked 15 years of her life away. She had trained younger employees who now earned twice her salary. She had covered for managers who took credit for her ideas. She had smiled through humiliation after humiliation, all because she needed this job. But not anymore. With trembling fingers, she opened her desk drawer and pulled out a sheet of paper. Her resignation letter. She had written it 6 months ago but never had the courage to submit it. Tonight, that changed. Tonight, she was done being a victim. The security guard's footsteps echoed down the hallway as Deborah gathered her few personal items, a coffee mug from her church, a photo of her late parents, and a small cross that had sat on her desk for over a decade. 15 years reduced to items that fit in a shoebox. She walked to her supervisor's office and slid the resignation letter under his door. The paper made a soft whisper as it disappeared into the darkness, the sound of freedom, or perhaps the sound of her life beginning to unravel. As the elevator doors closed behind her for the final time, Deborah didn't know she was stepping into the darkest chapter of her life. She didn't know that in 6 months she would be holding a different piece of paper, this time a suicide note. And she certainly didn't know that the voice that would save her life was sitting in a small nonprofit office across town, also making a life-changing decision that very same night.
3 months. 3 months of rejection letters, automated emails, and the sound of doors closing in her face. Deborah had applied to over 200 positions, retail stores, offices, restaurants, anywhere that would hire a 55-year-old woman with decades of experience, but apparently no value in today's market. We've decided to move forward with other candidates. The same words, delivered with the same false politeness, over and over again. Sometimes they didn't even bother to respond. She sat in her small apartment, surrounded by bills that seemed to multiply like a cancer. The electric company had sent a final notice. The rent was 3 weeks overdue. Her savings account, once her security blanket, showed a balance that made her stomach clench. $247.83. The phone rang, and for a moment, hope fluttered in her chest. Maybe it was finally good news. Miss Washington, this is Jennifer from Hamilton Insurance. I'm calling about your job application. Deborah's heart raced. Unfortunately, we've decided that you're overqualified for the position. We're looking for someone who can grow with the company long-term. Overqualified. At 55, she was simultaneously too old and too experienced for entry-level positions, yet too risky for companies wanting someone who would be around for decades. The dial tone buzzed in her ear like the sound of another door slamming shut. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Dark circles under her eyes, gray roots showing through hair she could no longer afford to color. When did she become this person, this desperate, invisible woman that no one wanted? That night, she knelt beside her bed and prayed with the same words she had repeated for months. God, please open a door, any door. I'm trying to trust you, but I'm scared. I'm so scared. The silence that followed felt heavier than ever. Outside her window, the city buzzed with life. People with jobs, with purpose, with futures. Inside her apartment, Deborah felt like she was disappearing one day at a time. She didn't know that across town, in a small office decorated with motivational posters and tissue boxes, a young woman named Doris Linus was working late into the night. Doris ran Hope Harbor, a mental health nonprofit that provided crisis intervention services to people just like Deborah. What Deborah couldn't know was that Doris was staring at her own stack of bills, her own impossible numbers, and writing her own letter, not a resignation, but a closure notice for the nonprofit she had poured her heart into for 3 years. 2 women, 2 crises, 1 divine appointment that neither saw coming. 3 months. 3 months of rejection letters, automated emails, and the sound of doors closing in her face. Deborah had applied to over 200 positions, retail stores, offices, restaurants, anywhere that would hire a 55-year-old woman with decades of experience, but apparently no value in today's market. We've decided to move forward with other candidates. The same words, delivered with the same false politeness over and over again. Sometimes they didn't even bother to respond. She sat in her small apartment, surrounded by bills that seemed to multiply like a cancer. The electric company had sent a final notice. The rent was 3 weeks overdue. Her savings account, once her security blanket, showed a balance that made her stomach clench. $247.83. The phone rang, and for a moment, hope fluttered in her chest. Maybe it was finally good news. Miss Washington, this is Jennifer from Hamilton Insurance. I'm calling about your job application. Deborah's heart raced. Unfortunately, we've decided that you're overqualified for the position. We're looking for someone who can grow with the company long-term. Overqualified. At 55, she was simultaneously too old and too experienced for entry-level positions, yet too risky for companies wanting someone who would be around for decades. The dial tone buzzed in her ear like the sound of another door slamming shut. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Dark circles under her eyes, gray roots showing through hair she could no longer afford to color. When did she become this person, this desperate, invisible woman that no one wanted? That night, she knelt beside her bed and prayed with the same words she had repeated for months. God, please open a door, any door. I'm trying to trust you, but I'm scared. I'm so scared. The silence that followed felt heavier than ever. Outside her window, the city buzzed with life. People with jobs, with purpose, with futures. Inside her apartment, Deborah felt like she was disappearing one day at a time. She didn't know that across town, in a small office decorated with motivational posters and tissue boxes, a young woman named Doris Linus was working late into the night. Doris ran Hope Harbor, a mental health nonprofit that provided crisis intervention services to people just like Deborah. What Deborah couldn't know was that Doris was staring at her own stack of bills, her own impossible numbers, and writing her own letter, not a resignation, but a closure notice for the nonprofit she had poured her heart into for 3 years. 2 women, 2 crises, 1 divine appointment that neither saw coming.
The note sat on Deborah's kitchen table for 3 days before she could bring herself to touch it. She had written it on a Tuesday morning when the electricity bill arrived, with final notice stamped in red across the top. The words had poured out of her like a dam breaking. To whoever finds this, I am sorry. I tried to keep going, but I'm tired of being invisible. I'm tired of being a burden. Maybe my life insurance will be enough to cover the bills I'm leaving behind. Please donate my things to the church. God forgive me. It wasn't the note she had planned to write. She had imagined something profound, something that would explain the depth of her pain. Instead, it was just tired words from a tired woman who couldn't see past tomorrow. On Friday morning, she woke up with a strange sense of purpose. She cleaned her apartment until it sparkled, washed and folded every piece of clothing, organized her papers so whoever came after her would find everything in order. She even cooked a full meal and put the leftovers in containers labeled for her neighbor, Mrs. Abraham, who had been kind to her during these dark months. The sleeping pills were still in their bottle, still sitting on the counter like a question waiting for an answer. Her research had told her what she needed to know: 30 pills with a glass of wine. She would go to sleep and simply not wake up. No mess, no drama, just quiet. She had chosen Sunday evening. There was something poetic about it. Ending on the same day of the week she used to find hope in church. She would attend one last service, sit in her usual back pew, listen to Pastor Andrew talk about God's love one final time, and then come home to peace. But Saturday night, as she lay in bed rehearsing her plan, the strangest thing happened. Her mother's voice came to her as clearly as if she were sitting on the edge of the bed. "Baby girl, you always were too stubborn to ask for help." Her mother had been dead for 10 years, but the voice was unmistakable. Growing up, whenever Deborah got overwhelmed with school or work or life, her mother would find her hiding in her room and say those exact words. It was her way of reminding Deborah that pride could be more dangerous than any problem she faced. Ask for help, baby girl. There's no shame in asking for help. Deborah sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She looked around the empty room, half expecting to see her mother's gentle smile, but there was only darkness in the sound of her own breathing. Ask for help. But who could she ask? She had already exhausted her savings, her job prospects, her connections. Her church friends meant well, but their kind suggestions felt more like judgment. Her few family members lived far away and had their own struggles. Then she remembered the card. Months ago, during one of her darkest nights, she had called the suicide prevention hotline. The counselor had been kind, professional, and had mailed her a follow-up card with the number written in careful handwriting. She had stuck it in her wallet and forgotten about it. Maybe she could make one last call. Not to say goodbye, but to ask for help. To tell someone how scared she was, how invisible she felt, how the silence in her apartment was becoming louder than screaming. It wouldn't change anything. She knew that. But her mother's voice kept echoing. Ask for help, baby girl. Sunday evening came with an unusual warmth for October. Deborah had skipped church. She couldn't bear the thought of sitting through a service knowing what she planned to do afterward. Instead, she spent the day in her clean apartment, watching the sun move across her walls like a slow goodbye. At 8 p.m., she pulled the card from her wallet. The number was printed in blue, 1-800-273-8255. Below it, someone had written in pen, Hope Harbor Crisis Line, Doris C., Director. She didn't notice the handwritten name. She was too focused on working up the courage to dial. Across town, Doris Linus was sitting in her office for what she believed would be the last time. The closure notice had been sent to the board. The phone service would be disconnected on Monday. 3 years of building Hope Harbor, 3 years of answered calls and saved lives was ending because the grants had dried up and the donations weren't enough. She was about to leave when the phone rang. For a moment, she considered letting it go to voicemail, but old habits die hard, and Doris had never been able to ignore a call to the crisis line. She picked up the phone, not knowing she was about to receive the most important call of her life. Hope Harbor Crisis Line, this is Doris. The phone rang 3 times before someone answered. Deborah's hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the receiver. Hope Harbor Crisis Line, this is Doris. The voice hit Deborah like a physical blow. She knew that voice. Even after all these years, even through the professional calm of a crisis counselor, she knew it immediately. Hello? Are you there? It's okay, take your time. Doris. The same Doris she had mentored 6 years ago. The same Doris who had lived in her car and contemplated suicide until Deborah helped her find hope. The same Doris who had sent that distant, polite text 3 months ago and then disappeared from her life. Deborah's mind raced. Should she hang up? This felt like a cosmic joke, calling a suicide hotline and reaching someone who had essentially turned her back when she needed help. But something in Doris's voice, that gentle patience she remembered so well, kept her on the line. Deborah's voice came out as a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. I don't know if I should be calling. You should absolutely be calling, Doris said, and Deborah could hear her settling into her chair, giving this conversation her full attention. That's exactly what this line is for. Can you tell me what's going on? For a moment, Deborah considered disguising her voice, pretending to be someone else. But she was so tired of pretending, so exhausted from carrying this burden alone. I'm 55 years old. I lost my job 6 months ago. I have applied everywhere, and no one wants me. I'm 3 months behind on rent. My electricity might be cut off tomorrow. I have $200 left in the world, and Her voice broke. I wrote a note today. I have pills. I just wanted to talk to someone before what? Doris's voice was steady, professional, but Deborah caught something else underneath. A tremor of recognition, perhaps, or maybe just the natural response of someone who had once stood at the same precipice. Before I give up, Deborah whispered. The silence stretched between them for what felt like an eternity. When Doris spoke again, her voice was softer, more personal. Can you tell me your name?
This was the moment. Once she said her name, there would be no pretending, no hiding. Doris would know that the woman who had once saved her life was now calling to end her own. "My name is Deborah. Deborah Washington." The silence that followed was different this time. Deborah could hear Doris's sharp intake of breath, could almost feel the shock radiating through the phone line. "Deborah?" Doris's voice was barely a whisper now, all professional composure abandoned. "Deborah Washington from Grace Community Church?" "Yes." "Oh my God. Oh my God, Deborah, it's me. It's Doris Linus." And there it was, the moment when two lives intersected again, when the woman who had once pulled Doris from the brink found herself being pulled back by the same person. "I know," Deborah said, tears streaming down her face. "I recognized your voice. Deborah, I can't believe this. I was about to close this place down tonight. I was going to lock the doors and never come back. The funding ran out, and I thought..." Doris's voice broke. "I thought no one needed us anymore." They were both crying now, both overwhelmed by the impossibility of this moment, by the intricate timing that had brought them back together at the exact moment when they needed each other most. "Why didn't you call me?" Doris whispered. "When you were going through all this, why didn't you reach out?" "I did. 3 months ago. You said you'd let me know if you heard of anything." The words hung in the air like an accusation, but not an angry one. Just a statement of fact that made Doris's breath catch in her throat. "I remember," Doris whispered. "I was so busy, so stressed about the nonprofit failing. I got your text and I thought I'd get back to you when things settled down, but they never settled down, and then I forgot." "Oh God, Deborah, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." "It's okay," Deborah said, though they both knew it wasn't. "Not yet. No, it's not okay. You saved my life 6 years ago. You spent hours with me, believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. And when you needed me, I was too wrapped up in my own problems to see yours." Doris was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a strength that Deborah remembered from their old mentoring sessions. "Deborah, listen to me. Don't take those pills. Can you promise me that?" "I don't know if I can promise that," Deborah said honestly. "Then promise me this. Can you come to my office right now? Can you give me a chance to help you the way you once helped me?" Deborah looked around her spotless apartment, at the note on the table, at the pills on the counter. For 6 months, she had been drowning in isolation, convinced that she was truly alone in the world. Now, suddenly, there was a lifeline. "Where is your office?" she asked.
The Hope Harbor office was tucked into a strip mall between a laundromat and a tax preparation service. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place people visited reluctantly, out of desperation rather than hope. But as Deborah pushed through the glass door at 9:30 p.m., she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the possibility that she wasn't as alone as she thought. Doris was waiting for her, and seeing her face to face after all these years was like looking at a ghost. The last time Deborah had seen Doris Linus, she had been a broken 24-year-old living in her car, thin from inconsistent meals and hollow-eyed from sleepless nights spent battling depression and anxiety. The woman who stood before her now was transformed, confident, professional, with the kind of quiet strength that comes from surviving your worst moments and choosing to help others do the same. But in that moment, as their eyes met across the small waiting room, they were both reduced to who they had been 6 years ago, a mentor and a mentee, a woman who had learned to save lives and a woman whose life had been saved. They stood there for a long moment, neither sure how to bridge the gap between their shared past and their present crisis. Finally, Doris spoke. "You look exactly the same," she said, though they both knew it wasn't true. The months of unemployment had carved lines around Deborah's eyes and stolen the confident posture she had once carried. "You look successful," Deborah replied, and she meant it. Whatever Doris had built here, whatever she had created from the ashes of her old life, it radiated from her like a quiet light. Doris laughed, but there was no humor in it. Successful at failing, maybe. Deborah, I need to tell you something, and it's going to sound like I'm making this up, but I swear it's true. She gestured toward her desk, which was covered with boxes and files. I was here tonight to pack up. Hope Harbor is closing. The board meeting was this morning, and I sent the closure notice 3 hours ago. I was supposed to disconnect the phone service, but I kept putting it off. I kept thinking, what if someone calls? What if someone needs help? Deborah looked around the office, at the motivational posters on the walls, the comfortable chairs arranged for counseling sessions, the shelf full of self-help books and crisis intervention manuals. This wasn't just a job for Doris, it was a calling. So when you called, Doris continued, her voice thick with emotion, I almost didn't answer. I had my keys in my hand. I was ready to leave, but something made me pick up that phone. Why is it closing? Deborah asked. Doris sank into one of the chairs and gestured for Deborah to sit across from her. Money. It always comes down to money. The grants that funded us for the first 3 years weren't renewed. Individual donations barely cover the phone bill. I've been working without salary for 6 months, living off my savings, trying to keep this place open. But you can't run a nonprofit on good intentions. They sat in silence for a moment, both contemplating the cruel irony of their situation. A crisis counselor about to lose her calling, just as someone desperately in need of counseling found her. How many people have you helped? Deborah asked. Over 2 years, maybe 2,000 calls. I don't know how many lives that translates to. Some people call multiple times, some call once, and I never hear from them again, and I spend weeks wondering if they're okay. 2,000 people? Deborah repeated. Doris, you can't close this place. I can't keep it open either, not without funding. She leaned forward, her professional demeanor returning. But we're not here to talk about my problems. We're here because you're in crisis, and I may have failed you as a friend, but I will not fail you as a counselor. For the next hour, Doris did what she did best. She listened. She asked gentle questions that helped Deborah articulate feelings she had been carrying alone for months. She validated the very real challenges of age discrimination, the psychological toll of constant rejection, the way financial desperation can make even the strongest person feel worthless. But more than that, she helped Deborah remember who she was before the job loss, before the rejections, before the bills began piling up. Do you remember what you used to tell me, Doris asked, when I was living in my car and convinced that I was worthless? Deborah shook her head. So much of that time felt like a blur of meetings and prayer sessions and gentle encouragement. You told me that sometimes God allows us to be broken down completely because He wants to rebuild us into something stronger. You said that rock bottom is sometimes the best foundation for a new beginning. The words came back to Deborah slowly. She had said them, believed them, lived by them during her years as a mentor and volunteer. But it was easier to believe in God's plan for other people than to trust it for yourself. I also remember that you told me every setback was a setup for a comeback. You said that when it looked like I had lost everything, that's when God was making space for something better. That's easy to say when you're not the one losing everything, Deborah said quietly. But you weren't just saying it, Deborah. You were living it. Do you remember telling me about your own dark times? About how you lost your job when you were 35 and thought your life was over? About how that loss led you to the church volunteer work that eventually connected you with me? Deborah had forgotten. In the midst of her current crisis, she had completely forgotten her own testimony, her own proof that God could turn devastation into purpose. Doris reached across the small space between their chairs and took Deborah's hands. I have something I need to ask you, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Deborah nodded. I can't afford to keep this place open as Hope Harbor, but what if we reopened it as something different? What if we created a nonprofit that specifically helps people over 50 who are struggling with unemployment, age discrimination, and the unique challenges of starting over later in life? Deborah stared at her. Doris, I don't understand. I'm offering you a job, Deborah. Not just any job, the job you were born to do.
You would be the program director. You would help design services for people who are facing exactly what you're facing now. You would be the voice on the other end of the phone for people who feel invisible and forgotten. The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. I can't afford to pay you, Doris continued. Not yet. But I have connections to grant writers, and I have 3 years of experience running a nonprofit. More importantly, I have you. Someone who understands this demographic from the inside out, someone who has the heart and the experience to help people who are drowning in the same waters you've been swimming in. Deborah felt something stirring in her chest that she hadn't felt in months, the flutter of possibility. You would do that, she whispered, after I called you tonight ready to? After you were ready to close this place down? Doris smiled through her tears. Deborah, don't you see? This is why I couldn't bring myself to disconnect that phone. This is why something made me answer your call. We both needed saving tonight. You needed someone to remind you of your value, and I needed someone to remind me of my purpose. They sat there in that small office, surrounded by boxes and dreams that almost died, both of them beginning to see that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another.
6 months later, Deborah sat at her new desk in what was now called Second Chapter Solutions, answering her third call of the morning. The voice on the other end belonged to Robert Jacob, a 58-year-old engineer who had been laid off after 23 years with the same company. I feel like I'm invisible, he was saying, and Deborah's heart clenched with recognition. Like the world decided I'm too old to matter anymore. Robert, Deborah said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had walked through that particular fire. I want you to know that what you're feeling is real, and it's valid, and you are not alone in this fight. She had said these words hundreds of times over the past 6 months, but they never lost their power because she meant them, because she had lived them. The transformation of Hope Harbor into Second Chapter Solutions had been nothing short of miraculous. Within 2 weeks of that late-night conversation, Doris had connected with a grant writer who specialized in funding for innovative social programs. Within a month, they had received their first grant, $75,000, to pilot a program specifically designed for job seekers over 50. But the real miracle wasn't the money, it was watching Deborah come alive in ways that neither of them had expected. During her months of unemployment, Deborah had felt like a failure, a woman whose best years were behind her. But as Second Chapter Solutions grew, she discovered that her failure had actually been preparation. Every rejection letter had given her insight into the barriers facing older job seekers. Every sleepless night worrying about bills had taught her the psychological toll of financial insecurity. Every moment of feeling invisible had prepared her to see and validate others who felt the same way. The thing about being in your 50s or 60s, Deborah would tell the people who called, is that society treats you like you're past your expiration date. But what they don't understand is that you're not spoiled goods, you're aged to perfection. You have wisdom they can't teach in business school, experience they can't download from the internet, and resilience they've never had to develop. The program they created was unlike anything else in the city. They offered practical services, resume writing tailored to combat age bias, interview coaching that addressed the unique challenges older workers faced, networking events that connected people with employers who valued experience over youth. But they also offered something that most job placement services ignored: emotional support for the psychological trauma of late career unemployment. Deborah had developed a workshop called Invisible No More that addressed the shame and self-doubt that plagued older job seekers. She would start each session by sharing her own story, not the sanitized version where everything worked out in the end, but the raw, honest account of what it felt like to believe you were worthless at 55. I wrote a suicide note, she would tell each new group, watching their faces change as they realized they weren't alone in their darkest thoughts. I had the pills counted out. I was done.
And the only reason I'm standing here today is because I made one final call to someone I had helped years earlier who reminded me that my story wasn't over. The workshop was always full. The waiting list grew longer every month. Word spread through the over 50 community like wildfire. There was a place where people understood, where your age was seen as an asset rather than a liability, where someone who had walked through the valley of unemployment was waiting to walk with you toward the other side. By month 3, they had helped 42 people find employment. By month 6, the number had grown to over 100. But Deborah's favorite success story wasn't measured in job placements. It was Martha Linus, Doris's 70-year-old mother, who had never worked outside the home but found herself needing income after her husband's death. Traditional job placement agencies had dismissed her immediately. A 70-year-old with no formal work experience was unemployable by conventional standards. But Deborah saw something else. A woman who had managed a household budget for 50 years, raised 4 children, cared for aging parents, and organized community events. Within 2 weeks, Martha was working part-time at a senior center, using her organizational skills to coordinate programs and her natural empathy to connect with residents who felt forgotten by the world. "You gave my mother her dignity back," Doris had told Deborah one evening as they worked late in their office. She was starting to see herself as a burden. Now she talks about her clients and her programs like she's running a corporation. The success of Second Chapter Solutions attracted attention from other cities. Deborah found herself traveling to conferences, consulting with other nonprofits, being interviewed by journalists who wanted to understand how 2 women had created such an effective model for serving an overlooked population. But the moment that meant the most came on a Tuesday afternoon in April, when Deborah's phone rang and the voice on the other end was achingly familiar. "Second Chapter Solutions, this is Deborah." "Deborah, it's Margaret Richardson from church." Margaret, the woman who suggested that Deborah should be less picky about jobs, who had recommended grocery store work with that patronizing smile that made Deborah feel small and desperate. "I hope you remember me," Margaret continued, her voice much more humble than Deborah remembered. I'm calling because I need help. My husband lost his job 3 weeks ago. At 62, he's facing the same invisible wall that Deborah had encountered, the same dismissive attitudes and age discrimination that she once tried to minimize with well-meaning advice, but hurtful advice. "Can you help us?" Margaret asked, and she could hear the fear and desperation that she recognized so well. "Of course we can help," Deborah said without a moment's hesitation. "Can you come in tomorrow afternoon? I'll personally work with you and your husband." There was a pause, and when Margaret spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. "Deborah, I owe you an apology. Last year when you were going through this, I said some thoughtless things. I didn't understand how hard it really is. I'm so sorry." "Margaret," Deborah said gently, "apology accepted. And more than that, you're gonna be okay. We're gonna figure this out together." After she hung up, Deborah sat in her office and marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had written a suicide note. Today, she was offering hope to the woman who had once made her feel hopeless. The phone rang again. It always did, all day long. People reaching out because they had heard about the place where age was honored instead of hidden, where experience was celebrated instead of dismissed, where the most painful chapter of someone's life could become the foundation for their most meaningful work. "Second Chapter Solutions, this is Deborah." She answered, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned that rock bottom could indeed be the best foundation for a new beginning. Doris walked into her office just as she was finishing the call, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had just received good news. 3 more grants approved, she announced, setting a cup on Deborah's desk. "We can hire 2 more counselors and extend our services to 3 more counties." Deborah smiled, but her expression grew serious. "Doris, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "That night I called you. What would have happened if you hadn't answered, if you had already gone home? Doris considered the question carefully. I think about that a lot, actually. If I hadn't answered, you might not be here. And if you weren't here, this place wouldn't exist, which means hundreds of people wouldn't have found jobs, wouldn't have found hope, wouldn't have discovered that their lives still had purpose. She paused, staring out the window at the busy street where people of all ages hurried past, each carrying their own stories of struggle and triumph. But here's what I really believe. I think God knew that call was coming. I think He knew that you needed me and I needed you, and all those people who would eventually call us needed us both. I think everything, your job loss, my financial crisis, even that awful period when I was too busy to respond to your text, I think all of it was orchestrating this moment. Divine timing, Deborah said quietly. Divine timing, Doris agreed. It never fails, even when we can't see it. That evening, as Deborah locked up the office and walked to her car, she thought about the note she had written almost a year ago. She had kept it not as a reminder of her darkest moment, but as proof of how completely God could transform a story. Where the note had once said, "I am tired of being invisible," she now helped dozens of people discover their visibility every week. Where it had said, "I am tired of being a burden," she now carried the stories of people who had found their value again through second chapter solutions. And where it ended with, "God forgive me," she now began every day with, "God thank you." 2 lives saved. That's how it started. One desperate phone call between 2 women who had once found each other and then lost each other and then found each other again at exactly the right moment. But as Deborah drove home through the city streets, past the strip malls and offices where other people were working late and struggling with their own invisible battles, she realized that the count was much higher now. 2 lives saved had become hundreds of lives transformed, and the story was just beginning.
1 year to the day after her darkest moment, Deborah Washington stood before an audience of 300 people at the National Conference on Age and Employment. The irony was not lost on her. Exactly 12 months earlier, she had been convinced that no one wanted to hear what she had to say. Now, she was the keynote speaker at a conference attended by employers, policymakers, and advocates from across the country. But as she looked out at the sea of faces, she wasn't thinking about her professional success or the recognition that second chapter solutions had gained. She was thinking about the phone call that had changed everything and the timing that had made it possible. 12 months ago, she began, her voice steady and strong. I was sitting in my apartment with a bottle of pills, convinced that my life was over. I was 55 years old, unemployed, invisible, and certain that I had nothing left to offer the world. The audience was completely silent, leaning forward to catch every word. I had written a note, made a plan, chosen a day. The only thing left was to carry it out. But someone whispered to me in the darkness, "Ask for help, baby girl. Ask for help." She paused, letting the words settle. So I made one final call to a suicide hotline. I expected to talk to a stranger, to receive some generic comfort before saying goodbye to a world that no longer seemed to have a place for me. Instead, I reached a woman I had mentored years earlier, a woman who was sitting in her office that night, about to shut down her nonprofit because she thought no one needed her services anymore. Deborah smiled, finding Doris's face in the audience. 2 women. 2 crises, 1 phone call. And in that moment, we both discovered something that I want to share with every person in this room who has ever felt invisible, forgotten, or past their prime. She clicked to her first slide, which showed a simple equation: your greatest pain plus God's perfect timing equals your greatest purpose. The job that rejected me, that made me feel worthless, that pushed me to the brink, that job was never my destiny. It was my detour. Every rejection letter, every sleepless night, every moment of feeling invisible was preparing me for the work I was actually called to do.
She clicked to the next slide, showing statistics about age discrimination and older worker unemployment. There are millions of people over 50 in this country who are facing exactly what I faced. They're talented, experienced, and valuable, but they're being told by a youth-obsessed culture that their best days are behind them. They're not looking for charity or pity. They're looking for opportunity and dignity and the chance to contribute their wisdom to a world that desperately needs it. The audience began to applaud, but Deborah raised her hand. But here's what I really want you to understand. My story isn't special because I survived. My story is special because I learned that sometimes God allows us to be broken down completely so He can rebuild us into something stronger. Sometimes He allows us to lose everything we thought we wanted so He can give us everything we never knew we needed. She clicked to a photo of the Second Chapter Solutions team, 12 employees now, ranging in age from 28 to 73, all working together to serve a population that most of society had written off. The woman who answered my call that night, she's now my business partner and my dearest friend. The nonprofit she was about to close has become a model that's being replicated in 15 cities across the country. The skills I thought were worthless? They've helped over 400 people find not just jobs, but purpose. She clicked to her final slide, which showed a simple message. Your story isn't over. It's just beginning. I want to close with this truth. If you are sitting in this audience today and you feel forgotten, if you've been told you're too old or too experienced or too whatever, I need you to know that your greatest contribution may still be ahead of you. The world needs your wisdom. It needs your experience. It needs the perspective that can only come from having lived through both triumphs and failure. She paused, her eyes scanning the audience, making eye contact with as many people as possible. But more than anything else, I want you to remember this. God's timing never fails. Even when we can't see it, even when we can't understand it, even when we're convinced it's too late, it never fails. The standing ovation lasted for 5 full minutes. But as Deborah stood on that stage, watching hundreds of people rise to their feet, she wasn't thinking about the applause. She was thinking about all the people who weren't in this room. The ones sitting in apartments like hers had been, staring at bills they couldn't pay, writing notes they hoped they'd never have to use. She was thinking about the phone calls that would come tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Because somewhere out there at this very moment, someone was having their darkest hour, and they didn't know yet that it was actually the beginning of their brightest chapter. After the conference, as Deborah and Doris sat in the hotel bar sharing a quiet drink, Doris raised her glass. To divine timing, and to the truth that our greatest failures often become our greatest qualifications. They drank to that truth and to the mysterious way that pain can become purpose, brokenness can become strength, and the moment you think your story is ending might actually be the moment when your real story finally begins. Outside the hotel window, the city hummed with life. Millions of people carrying their own struggles, their own dreams, their own moments of despair and hope. And somewhere among them, someone was probably reaching for a phone, about to make the call that would save not just their life, but their purpose. Because God's timing never fails. Even when we can't see it, even when we can't understand it, even when we're convinced it's too late, it never fails.